In this online lecture, I want to look at some of the key concepts and theories which lay behind our understandings of gender politics. These are obviously going to be absolutely essential for when we come to look at gender in our lecture on Thursday afternoon. What I want to do is principally two things. First of all, I want to establish in your minds the distinction between sex and gender. And then secondly, I want to very briefly outline the various strands of feminist theorising on the role of the state. Again, these are going to be crucial ideas which we're going to need on Thursday afternoon. So the first thing that I would like to do is to look at this distinction between sex and gender. Now there's broadly two types of difference between men and women. Sex and gender. And the distinction, I think, is articulated well in the quotation on the screen from Anne Oakley. She says, sex is a word that refers to the biological differences between male and female, the visible difference in genitalia, the related difference in procreative function. Gender, however, is a matter of culture. It refers to the social classifications into masculine and feminine. So to elaborate a little bit more, it is the case, for example, that only women can give birth. This is a natural and sexual difference. It is not the case, however, that only women can engage in childcare. That is a difference constituted by gender identities and norms and expectations. So where sex is a matter of biological determination, gender is something which is socially constructed and therefore much more adaptable. For example, while gender roles which suggests that men are primarily breadwinners and women are primarily carers, are powerful ideas, these are not ideas which are impossible to change, and we have seen some shift in those understandings in the post-war period in British politics, as we'll see in the lecture on Thursday afternoon. So that's the kind of principal distinction between sex and gender that I want you to have in your mind as you're approaching this topic. What we also need to do is have some sense of how feminists have understood the British state and states more generally. Now, Diane Sainsbury has observed that the state is a crucial site in regulating and constructing gender relations, and I think it is the case that feminism is the principal theoretical perspective which has sought to explore that role in its greatest depth. However, as with any ideology or theory, it is difficult to characterize feminism. Rebecca West, an American journalist and author, wrote that I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat. Now, in a very general sense, following West, we might conceive of feminism as a movement which seeks to alleviate gender inequalities, and feminist goals as efforts to reduce gender inequality. However, it's generally accepted in the literature on feminism that there are a plurality of different approaches to the question of gender inequality and the role of the state in maintaining and changing that pattern of inequality. And in this online lecture, I want to focus on three broad varieties of feminist theory, each of which conceives of gender inequality and the role of the state in different ways. The first that I want to look at is liberal feminism. Liberal feminism emerges out of 19th century liberalism and understands the position of women in both society and the British political system in characteristically liberal terms. It sees women as individuals possessed of reason and as such entitled to full civil, human, political and economic rights which will allow them to explore their potential in equal competition with men. For liberal feminists, the existence of gender divisions is regarded as a product of prejudice and discrimination, inequality in rights, the lack of genuine equal opportunities, and the difficulties which women have faced in gaining access to public positions of power. For liberal feminists working from these assumptions, these kinds of difficulties which women face are to be best remedied by traditional liberal political strategies of lobbying and state action, particularly seeking changes in legislation. Implicit in that is that for liberal feminists, the state is potentially neutral and does not inevitably sustain male domination. For liberal feminists, men have captured state processes. Women, however, can mobilise to gain access and influence in the state which will allow them to remedy the discrimination which they encounter. So that's liberal feminism in very broad terms. Let's move on and look at Marxist and socialist feminism. Here, as we might expect, capitalism and its needs are the starting point for the analysis. For Marxist feminists, women are not oppressed but exploited. That exploitation is not inevitable but is a product of historical and social conditions. Gender inequality is seen to be principally a product of women's relationship with the capitalist system, particularly the way in which they service the functions of the capitalist system. For example, women provide a cheap and flexible workforce, very often described in the literature as a reserve army of labour. In addition to that, the unpaid work of women in the home is useful to capitalist interests in maintaining male workers. So accordingly, for Marxist feminists, gender divisions cannot be eradicated without fundamentally changing the economic relationships upon which they are based. In respect of the state, many Marxist feminists incorporate this kind of view of gender analysis into pre-existing Marxist theories of the state. So the state is often viewed as assisting and perpetuating gender inequalities which are functional to capitalism. Thirdly and finally, I want to look at radical feminism. Radical feminism emerged in the late 1960s as a challenge to liberal and Marxist and socialist varieties of feminism. Of all the varieties of feminism, it's perhaps the most diffuse and heterogeneous, and accordingly it's perhaps the hardest of the three varieties of feminism to characterise. A common point which I think binds many radical feminists is the concept of patriarchy. Now, there are many different definitions of patriarchy, but a convenient and serviceable one is provided by the feminist theorist Sylvia Walby. She describes patriarchy as a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. So it's therefore a system of universal oppression of women by men, and which all women share an interest in ending. For radical feminists, the state is a purposive actor designed by men to serve in their own male interests. And so accordingly they would regard the British state as helping to perpetuate patriarchy. So amongst radical feminists there is at the very minimum a profound suspicion and scepticism about the ability of state institutions to address the needs of women. Something very different, for example, from liberal feminism. However, for radical feminists, patriarchy is not maintained by the state in isolation. Male power rests upon multiple foundations. For example, some frequent themes of radical feminism include the role that biology and the reproductive roles of women play in their subordination in patriarchal societies. Others, for example Susan Brown-Miller and Andrea Dworkin, point to the role of male sexual violence in perpetuating male power. Others point to the role of culture in encouraging women to take subordinate roles in patriarchal societies. Likewise, the means by which radical feminists would address gender inequalities are also quite diverse. Some of those have been quite radical and confrontational. For example, there's been calls for an androgynous culture to erode differences between men and women. Alternatively, others have suggested undermining the role of heterosexuality as a mechanism of male power through political lesbian separatism. Now, many would regard that such proposals and activism by radical feminists are one of the many causes of the backlash against feminist politics and ideas which many scholars have identified at the end of the 20th century and at the beginning of the 21st century. That concludes all I want to say in this online lecture. If you've got any questions or queries about what I've spoken about here, do bring them to the lecture on Thursday afternoon, where I'll solicit as usual questions from you. Otherwise, thanks for listening and thanks for watching.